Hi, my name's Graeme Gillies. I'm a senior site reliability engineer for the GitLab.com infrastructure team. This video is my homework for the upcoming configure sprint based around Kubernetes integration of GitLab. I'll start by just briefly going over, what I put down in my answer to the questionnaire as the problems I see with the current Kubernetes GitLab integration vision. I think at a high level, it seems a little bit unfocused on where exactly we want to do and what we don't want to do. I believe there's a lot of excitement and a lot of hype about trying to get us to do more, become like a one-stop kind of shop. But I'm not sure if there's enough understanding and appreciation of what that actually means, especially from a support perspective. I'm very much kind of the opinion of try to do a smaller amount of things and do them well rather than trying to do a large amount of things and do them half-heartedly. One part of the vision I see that we're trying to look into, for example, is we want to grow our ability to deploy and maintain Kubernetes clusters themselves. And I'm not sure if there's really an appreciation of exactly what that actually means, because there's a lot of work that actually goes into that. One size does not fit all. And when we say a Kubernetes cluster, the software you use to deploy Kubernetes, how you deploy Kubernetes, the architectures, what you're actually doing behind the scenes, how you set it all up, actually varies quite a lot from company to company, implementation into implementation, deployment tooling to deployment tooling. So for us to, for example, to bite a piece of that off is a lot of work. And there's companies that are way bigger than GitLab that are actually focused on trying to do that kind of thing. An example I would like to understand is if we do have, tooling to deploy Kubernetes in GitLab, and for example, we have a customer that has a 500 node Kubernetes cluster deployed by GitLab, and they click the upgrade button to upgrade that cluster, and the upgrade fails, and all their cluster goes offline, and then they have a complete application outage. They're going to come to us and say, why did that work? Or essentially blame us. Because if we have a button or a tool or functionality to do something, then it's expected we own that and we deploy that, at least in the enterprises that I've worked at. Likewise, even though we may just be shipping what we call, a default Kubernetes distribution from upstream, if Kubernetes announces a CVE, so like a security issue, and we have customers who've deployed Kubernetes clusters with GitLab, they're going to ask us, when can they upgrade? When can they patch that CVE? So that's something we as a company have to respond to for Kubernetes itself on their behalf. I think related to that, I think another one of the problems with our vision is who is the target customer in terms of Kubernetes expertise. I think at the moment, probably a lot of the people that use GitLab and the Kubernetes integration are smaller groups. They're just starting on their Kubernetes journey. They're looking for a way to make it easy for them. They don't really understand how it works underneath or exactly what they're trying to do. They want to try and get as much out of the way as possible and just kind of focus on writing code, which is completely understandable. And I think that's obviously a very, very good place for us to target. However, there is the opposite end of the spectrum. Might be startups with high levels of Kubernetes expertise, or enterprises that are very big and have very large Kubernetes clusters from a different vendor like Red Hat or Pivotal or Rancher or someone. And so how do we kind of work with that and how do we fit in that model? And, how do we make our tooling usable to them if that's who we choose to go after? Another potential problem I see is that our system, they say that system design often mimics your company's organizational design. And I think I kind of see that a little bit with how our Kubernetes integration is currently built. It's a particularly rigid, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it's very much developed around a model of how we kind of do development at GitLab. Currently, anyone can spit up a Kubernetes cluster in certain G-Cloud projects and, attach that to GitLab, and they can give GitLab super admin privileges to their Kubernetes cluster in there, and they can test and do whatever. That model might work for some companies, but it's certainly not going to work for larger companies, certainly not in enterprises or anything that's remotely security conscious. You might only have access to a single namespace. You might only have access to a couple of namespaces. You might be running as a non-privileged user in a very large 500 node, 1,000 node Kubernetes environment. How does GitLab integrate with that? Because you as a small development team who's got one namespace in a cluster that's 500 nodes is a very different model to how we currently work things. But it's still a model I feel has a lot of growth, and still a model that I think is worthwhile exploring, considering that the best way for companies like GitLab to grow their adoption is by going after small teams inside larger organizations and growing from there. Finally, I will say I think the last kind of problem with the current Kubernetes GitLab integration vision is that the actual implementation pieces so far have come a long way, but they still feel very rocky. It still feels like there's a lot of pieces that's just kind of held together very loosely. A lot of just like bash scripts and CI jobs and scripts and bits and pieces just kind of working together independently. And it's like if something doesn't work, you've got to look through this raw output for a CI job to determine what happens. Then you kind of run a pipeline again to hope something is, fixed. And it just doesn't feel like a nice user experience. And it definitely doesn't feel like it's supports or understands the Kubernetes basic model of declarative infrastructure management, not imperative. Everything still feels like we wrap everything up in this imperative model and launch this CI job. It does this, it does this, it does this. Whereas really the goal with Kubernetes and what it's supposed to be used for is declare. You have a setter manifest that's defined how you want your workloads to be look inside of Kubernetes. You submit that to the Kube API server, and the engine and machinery that runs in that, whether it's Kubernetes itself or in operators or that, makes that happen. It should all be, the logic should be inside of Kubernetes itself to handle failure cases and to handle scaling cases and all that thing. You just tell it how you want it to look, and pieces in Kubernetes do the work. That is the real goal of adopting and using Kubernetes well. The next thing I'll talk about, I guess, is the state of technology and what's happening in the field. So I do feel like Kubernetes is it's at a state of growth and experimentation. What might be the best way to do something now might not be the best way in 6 months or even 3 months. It's a fast changing landscape, and it's hard to see what's worth investing in and what isn't. Likewise, people using Kubernetes and use it well do sometimes push their work out there, but you've got to go out and find it. It's not easy to find. And everyone does things differently. There are no real standards. The big things I do want to highlight is the fact that GitOps and what that means specifically in Kubernetes is very big. It's one of the big topics a lot of conference talks are about. There's whole mini conferences related to it. How the community has taken that word, defined it, and adapted it for Kubernetes use is quite strict. And it's it would be really interesting for us to really look at that and understand that more. Just because you have a Git repo somewhere with some deployment pieces in Kubernetes related to Kubernetes doesn't mean you're doing GitOps, for example. Similar, operators are largely becoming the real way forward for doing Kubernetes deployment and management. People are realizing that you're trying to do Kubernetes deployment and management and tooling outside, such as like CI jobs or traditional tools running outside the cluster, is very difficult. The operator pattern works with that Kubernetes mantra of declarative infrastructure. All you do is you submit manifests of what you want things to look like to Kubernetes, and you have all the operators inside working with Kubernetes to make that happen. That is the real kind of goal that people are looking at. Companies or implementations that inspire you. The two biggest companies that inspire me was CoreOS. Everything they related to Kubernetes deployment and management, and from the metal upwards, so how they did their CoreOS container operating system, their Bootkube, Matchbox, all of those toolings to deploy and manage Kubernetes was fantastic. It would basically set the standard for large parts of the entire industry. And then they were acquired by Red Hat. But Red Hat itself and their OpenShift product, which I've actually worked on when I used to work at Red Hat, is very inspiring to me as well. And it's actually probably our biggest competitor in parts of this space. We can just see OpenShift is just a Kubernetes distribution that it's not really competing. But if you actually look, the Kubernetes distribution part of OpenShift is the least exciting part of it at all. But the whole workflow deployment they have on top of it, the panels and everything they give for operators to manage it is extremely powerful. It's extremely compelling. And that development experience, I believe, is what we're trying to, capture and also do inside of GitLab. So I do think like that, looking to them for inspiration is very apt. I know my talk is quite long, so I'll stop there. Thank you.